She was supposed to save a franchise. And for a while, it looked exactly like that. Championship expectations, a rebuilt roster, a city holding its breath. Then the cameras started catching things nobody in Indianapolis wanted the world to see. Before we get into everything that unfolded this season, drop a like right now if you follow the WNBA or think Caitlin Clark is one of the most compelling athletes in sports today. It helps more than you know, and this story is worth every second. Because what happened inside the Indiana Fever's 2026 season isn't just a basketball story. It's a story about power, pressure, communication, and what happens when the most scrutinized player in women's sports history collides with a coaching staff trying to do its job in front of an audience that never looks away.
WNBA draft. The Indiana Fever select Caitlin Clark, University of Iowa.
Caitlin Clark did not walk into 2026 quietly. She walked in carrying the full weight of a narrative that had been building for months. A previous season cut short by injury. A roster that had been reassembled, reinforced, and essentially redesigned around her presence. And a fan base that had been told in every press conference and media session leading up to opening night that this was the year Indiana finally competed for a title. That kind of expectation doesn't leave much room for a slow start. It leaves no room at all. For games in, the record sat at 500. Even. Not a disaster. Not a revelation. And already, the basketball itself was fighting for attention against something else entirely. A defensive breakdown here. An animated sideline moment there. The kind of friction that in any other context, on any other team, would have stayed inside the locker room and dissolved before the next game tip. But this was not any other team. And Caitlin Clark is not any other player. The machinery of modern sports media, the social clips, the frame-by-frame analysis, the instant hot take economy was already pointed directly at Indiana.
1 being still trying to find your footing, and 10 being the best player that you can be in this league.
It had been pointed there since Clark's name was called at the draft. And that machinery does not wait for a full sample size before it starts drawing conclusions. What made the early weeks of the season so difficult to read clearly was not a single dramatic event. It was accumulation. Small moments stacking on top of each other faster than any one of them could be properly contextualized. And that accumulation was about to produce its first major flashpoint. The first visible incident involved assistant coach Brianne January.
Indiana Fever assistant coach, and more importantly, ASU Hall of Famer Brianne January. And
the details matter here, because they complicate the easy narrative considerably. January is not a random hire. She is a 7-time All-Defensive honoree, a Hall of Famer in the truest sense, a coach whose credentials on the defensive end of the floor are beyond legitimate dispute. This is someone players across the league would typically fight for the chance to learn from. Her credibility should have, by most traditional logic, ended any public pushback before it started. It didn't. What cameras caught was an animated exchange between Clark and January during a game Indiana actually won. The Fever beat Seattle 89-78. Clark herself put up 21 points, 10 assists, and 7 rebounds in limited minutes. Box score numbers that on any other night would have been the entire story. Instead, the headline was a courtside clip. Clark, visibly upset, getting up from her spot on the bench and physically relocating to another position after what appeared to be a heated disagreement with the coaching staff over defensive assignments. Think about what that image communicates to the outside world. A franchise cornerstone, in the middle of a winning performance, voluntarily putting visible distance between herself and her own coaches. In front of cameras that broadcast to millions of viewers and get clipped and reshared millions more times before midnight. Defense had been an issue that night, poor by several accounts. And the disagreement traced back exactly there to rotations, reads, positioning. The kind of technical argument that happens in every professional sport at every level of competition. The kind that usually gets forgotten by halftime. Except this one didn't get forgotten, because the optics attached to it were simply too striking to ignore. And because it was not the last time something like it would happen. If the Seattle moment raised eyebrows, the loss in Portland turned it into something else entirely. Indiana traveled to face the fire and returned home having played one of the ugliest games of their season, down by double digits at halftime, the margin stretching to 25 points by the third quarter. A performance so far from what the Fever had been built to produce that it demanded some kind of explanation.
Nearly lost it. Mitchell there to the rescue.
Clark's individual numbers were startling in the worst possible way. 6 points, 1 of 7 from the field. Numbers so far outside her established range that casual observers and longtime fans alike were left genuinely searching for what had gone wrong. But the number that nobody was talking about was the sequence that stopped the game cold. In the second quarter, with Indiana already struggling, cameras caught head coach Stephanie White appearing to call out a lack of defensive effort in Clark's direction. Clark responded from the bench, animated, hands moving, the kind of physical explanation that players use when they're trying to demonstrate a read they believe they made correctly, a rotation they think was missed by someone else, a coverage assignment that broke down before it reached them. White had seen enough. She told Clark to get up. Rookie Raven Johnson took the vacated spot on the bench, and Clark stood directly behind her own head coach, shaking her head, visible to every camera in a building full of cameras. What happened next is where the story fractures depending entirely on who is watching and what they believe about coaching, accountability, and the particular responsibilities that come with being a franchise cornerstone. One interpretation: this is coaching done correctly. You do not exempt your best player from standards that apply to everyone else. A staff that holds Clark accountable under pressure is a staff committed to something beyond just protecting its most valuable asset. By that argument, Portland wasn't dysfunction at all. It was the exact opposite. The other interpretation: there's a difference between holding a franchise player accountable and making a statement in a nationally broadcast blowout in a way that visually, unmistakably communicated tension to everyone watching.
And it looks like that was whistled intentional without even reviewing it.
One is philosophy. The other can look to a skeptical audience like something closer to a message being sent. That distinction landed on live television during halftime, where two analysts with decades of credibility between them watched the same 22 seconds of footage and came to noticeably different conclusions. One defended the decision straightforwardly.
38-second stretch where she drained deep three after deep three after deep three.
The other questioned whether the moment had been handled with the care a player of Clark's stature deserved. When two reasonable, experienced people watch the same clip and walk away with opposite readings, it means the moment was genuinely ambiguous. Ambiguity in the current sports media environment does not stay ambiguous for long. It gets pulled apart until a 60-second sequence becomes a referendum on an entire organization's approach to its most important relationship. There is also a part of this story that almost never made it into the loudest coverage. Raven Johnson, the rookie who stepped in when Clark stood up, didn't ask to be placed at the center of anything. She was the next player up. She made no choice except to respond when her name was called. Yet nearly every account of that substitution framed it entirely through the lens of what it meant for Clark, rarely what it meant for a young player suddenly caught in the frame of a controversy she had no role in creating. The rest day that turned suspicion into certainty. Just when the Portland narrative was beginning to settle, the organization handed its critics something new. Clark was scheduled to appear in a home game against Portland. Shortly before tip-off, word came that she would not be playing. The official explanation was a strategic management plan for the season. Rest. Maintenance. A deliberate, controlled decision about load management. Under almost any other circumstances, that announcement passes quietly. Professional sports teams manage their players. Start sit-out games. It is routine, documented, widely accepted across every major league. Fans may grumble, beat reporters may note it, and then everybody moves on. Except the timing here was almost architecturally designed to feed the worst possible interpretation. This was not a quiet mid-January maintenance day with nothing else happening around it. This came directly on the heels of multiple documented, nationally covered disagreements between Clark and the coaching staff. Fans who had bought tickets, some of whom had traveled hours, learned about the decision close enough to tip off that alternatives were no longer realistic. The reaction was immediate and it was not gentle. Some observers pointed at the timing directly, openly wondering whether strategic management was a more organizationally acceptable way of describing something connected to the recent friction rather than any genuine physical concern. Others fixated on the fans themselves, on the experience of paying to watch the league's biggest draw and arriving to find out she would not be taking the floor. A segment of the reaction leaned into outright disbelief that Indiana's most important player would sit out a home game this early in a season framed as a championship pursuit. Stephanie White addressed the speculation publicly and did not hedge. Clark was healthy. The team was not managing anything specifically tied to the recent incidents. The denial was clear, unambiguous, and direct. Denials, once a fan base has already been primed to read tension into every decision surrounding a star player, rarely move as fast or as far as the suspicion that preceded them. What this moment exposed more than anything else was not bad intent from the organization. It exposed a communication gap. The space between what a franchise knows internally about its star players' health and workload and what it chooses or fails to explain clearly to the people watching from outside. In an era where roster decisions get analyzed in real time by millions of people with immediate access to a platform, that gap does more reputational damage than the original decision ever could. And the gap had a documented history at this point. Earlier in the season, the Fever received a formal warning from the league itself for failing to properly notify officials about Clark's availability ahead of a game. A back issue had drifted through the injury report for stretches of the season, moving from probable to questionable and back again without ever producing a clear update fans could hold on to. None of that suggests medical negligence. Teams routinely handle soft tissue issues with caution. Conservative timelines exist because rushing a player back from anything involving the back carries serious long-term risk. The medical decisions may well have been sound all along. But caution and clarity are not the same thing. An organization can make the right call medically while simultaneously failing to communicate that call in a way that maintains trust with the people who care most about its player. When updates arrive late or change after fans have already made travel plans, frustration builds regardless of whether the underlying decision was defensible. And that frustration, more than the rest day itself, became the fuel that carried this story into its next and loudest chapter. When national media turned up the volume, at some point in a story like this, the local conversation stops being enough to contain it. This one reached that point fast. A national sport commentator, not a blogger, not a social media account, but a voice with an established platform and a reach that spans well beyond Indiana, went further than anyone had gone publicly. He didn't just question the coaching staff. He questioned whether Clark could trust anyone inside the organization at all. By his account, the dysfunction ran deeper than a disagreement about defensive rotations. It extended to the general manager, to the team president, and potentially even to Clark's own representation. The suggested solution, offered with a certainty that matched the drama of the claim, was an immediate trade request, not patience, not improved communication. A full exit framed as the only realistic path forward for a player being failed by the people responsible for her development. That kind of commentary raises two simultaneous and entirely legitimate questions. The first, does it reflect genuine, sourced insight into what is actually happening behind closed doors in Indianapolis? Commentators with real connections inside locker rooms and front offices do occasionally surface things that prove accurate long before they become public knowledge. The history of sports journalism is full of takes that looked like overreach until they didn't. The second, or is it the loudest possible version of a narrative designed to generate maximum engagement in a media landscape that rewards certainty far more than nuance? Sports commentary as an industry creates a powerful incentive to frame every disagreement as an existential crisis, because a five-alarm take travels further and faster than a measured one. The honest answer is probably that both questions are partially correct at the same time. What is harder to dismiss is the broader convergence of independent voices rather than a single outlier chasing attention. When respected broadcasters disagree on live television about how a bench moment should be read, when a veteran commentator suggests a trade, when a fan base reacts with genuine, widespread alarm to a rest day announcement that in another context would have barely registered, that is not one narrative being manufactured by one person. That is multiple separate threads arriving at the same uncomfortable question from different directions. Whether the people responsible for developing the most commercially significant player in the league's modern history are doing so in a way that genuinely serves her long-term interests, both as a competitor and as the centerpiece of a franchise built around her future. The layer nobody's discussing loudly enough. There's a quieter dimension to this story that rarely makes it into the most prominent takes, and it deserves more space than it typically gets. Clark's relationship to the WNBA's financial health is not like a typical star's relationship to their franchise. It is by virtually every measurable metric, outsized in a way that has no recent precedent in women's basketball. Television ratings climb when she plays. Arena attendance shifts depending on whether she is listed as probable or questionable on an injury report. Merchandise numbers move around her presence in ways that affect the entire league's economic picture, not just Indiana's. That reality means questions about how she is coached, protected, and communicated with carry a weight that extends well beyond one team's locker room decisions. When commentators raise alarms about organizational trust, they're tapping into a broader anxiety. Whether the infrastructure surrounding the league's most visible and commercially important player has actually caught up to the scale of her importance. Whether the systems designed before she arrived, the coaching hierarchies, the communication frameworks, the organizational structures were built for a player of her specific kind of impact. The coaches themselves are working in a genuinely difficult position. The conventional wisdom of elite coaching says you are hardest on your best players because those are the players who can absorb it and still perform. Brian January's defensive resume was even invoked publicly as a reason Clark should defer without resistance. And there is real logic in that argument. Stars who stop being coached aggressively often stop improving. But tough coaching and eroding trust are not mutually exclusive. An organization can demand excellence from its franchise player while simultaneously failing to communicate that demand in a way that keeps the relationship intact. Those two things can exist in the same building at the same time without either canceling the other out. That is the uncomfortable space Indiana appears to have been operating in for much of this season. Not necessarily a broken relationship, not necessarily dysfunction in any catastrophic sense, but a gap between intent and execution that, under the particular magnitude of attention surrounding this specific player, becomes a story whether or not anyone inside the organization intended it to. Winning changes the optics. It doesn't resolve the question. Here is where the narrative becomes genuinely complicated for anyone tempted to land cleanly on one side of it. After that rough stretch, Indiana started winning. Not barely winning, actually winning consistently, in a way that reflected real competitive progress rather than just variance. Clark's playmaking returned to the form that turned her into a household name in the first place. She began setting franchise records, climbing all-time leaderboards, posting box scores that earned Conference Player of the Week recognition in consecutive weeks. The team climbed the standings. What had looked, during the worst of the Portland aftermath, like a potentially season-defining collapse began to look in retrospect like a rough patch absorbed and moved past. A 4-game winning streak that nobody in May had seen coming. Winning has a specific kind of power in professional sports. It quiets the outside noise with a thoroughness that no press conference or organizational statement ever fully achieves. Analysts pivot their framing. Fan bases that were asking hard questions start celebrating instead. The story that felt like a crisis 2 weeks ago starts to look like a test that was passed. But passing a test and resolving what caused it are two different things. Coaching staffs and star players can absolutely repair friction through shared success and accumulated time. The existence of a turnaround does not retroactively prove that the friction was manufactured. It does not automatically mean the underlying dynamics have been fully resolved behind closed doors where cameras cannot reach. Plenty of successful partnerships in professional sports carry unresolved tension deep into a championship run because winning gives everyone involved less incentive to dig further into the discomfort. What the winning streak cannot do on its own is close the communication gap that made the rest day controversy so damaging. That gap does not heal through box scores. It heals through consistency, through health updates that arrive with enough clarity to prevent suspicion from rushing in to fill the silence. Through public explanations that match what people can see with their own eyes on the court. Through the accumulated evidence over months and games and difficult moments that the relationship between this organization and its franchise player holds together under pressure, not just when things are going smoothly. Trust, once shaken in a fan base this large, this engaged, and this invested, does not rebuild itself automatically because the wins start coming. It rebuilds slowly through different means entirely. Well, this actually leaves us. Both things are true. That is the part of this story that resists the clean resolution any good narrative wants to deliver. The same coaching staff that benched Caitlin Clark in Portland during a nationally broadcast blowout is the same staff whose system currently has her playing some of the most efficient basketball of her professional career. The same organization that fumbled the communication around a rest day, generating weeks of national suspicion in the process, is the same one currently riding a winning streak its franchise player is leading in record-setting fashion. Pretending otherwise in either direction means telling only half the story. Ignoring the early tension to celebrate the winning streak erases real, documented incidents that shaped a significant portion of the season. Refusing to acknowledge the improvement to sustain a crisis narrative ignores something equally real and equally documented. The actual question hanging over Indianapolis right now is not whether another sideline clip goes viral. Those happen in every sport, on every team, at every level of competition. Some of them mean something. Many of them don't. The question is whether the communication infrastructure around this specific franchise player gets meaningfully better before the next difficult stretch of games forces it to be tested again. Because there will be a next difficult stretch. That is the nature of a long season, of a championship pursuit, of a star player operating under pressure that has no real precedent in the modern history of this league. The losses will come back. The moments of friction will come back. The cameras will keep rolling. When they do, will the explanations be clearer? Will the updates be more timely? Will the organization's public framing match what the people who care most about this player can see happening on the court? Winning buys patience. It is not by trust. And Indiana's coaching staff, by every available sign, appears to be operating with the understanding that distinction is still being tested in real time, even with the wins piling up. That is where this season stands. Not resolved, not broken. Somewhere in the complicated, frustrating, fascinating middle, where most real stories about real teams actually live. If this gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. Do you think Indiana is handling this situation the right way? Are they failing Caitlin Clark or coaching her the way every elite player eventually gets coached? The conversation in the comments is always worth reading. Hit subscribe because this story has chapters still being written, and the next one could come any game from now.